Imagine sitting quietly in a park you've called home for over 30 years, only to be approached by a young officer who demands to know if you belong there. How would you react if your peaceful morning turned into a confrontation rooted in nothing more than your appearance? And what happens when the officer learns the truth about the man he's trying to intimidate? This is a story of justice, karma, and a powerful revelation that leaves everyone stunned. Stay with us to see how one quiet moment set off a chain reaction that changed everything. Before we jump into today's story, drop where you're watching from in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet city of Trenton, Tennessee. The early morning light spilled through the branches of the tall oaks, casting long shadows across Grant Park. It was the kind of morning that made you stop and savor the peacefulness, a rarity in these times. On an old wooden bench close to the center of the park sat an elderly man, Raymond Brooks. His hands, rough and weathered from years of hard work, held a warm cup of coffee. His salt and pepper hair was cut short, a reminder of his days in the military. His posture was still upright, his back straight, though time had begun to slow him down. He glanced down at the folded newspaper resting in his lap, a part of his morning ritual. Raymond was a fixture in this park. For nearly 30 years, he had started each day the same way, quietly, with coffee and the news, watching as the world woke up around him. A jogger would pass by, offering a polite wave. A couple with their dog would nod in greeting. Raymond would return each gesture with a warm smile. This morning, however, there was something off in the air. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt a tension that wasn't usually there. The park was mostly empty, except for a few early risers. As Raymond took a slow sip of his coffee, he noticed a man in uniform walking through the entrance of the park. At first, he thought little of it. Trenton wasn't a big city, and the local police officers were familiar faces. But this officer, a younger man with a stern face, was new to Raymond. Officer David Clark, fresh out of the academy and eager to make his mark, moved with the kind of authority that felt just a little too heavy for the occasion. His eyes scanned the park, settling on Raymond sitting alone on his bench. Raymond noticed the officer's gaze and felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was a look in the officer's eyes that made him uneasy, the kind of look he had seen too many times before. Officer Clark approached with purpose, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel path. Raymond kept his eyes on the newspaper, hoping the officer would just keep walking. But he didn't. "Good morning," the officer said, his voice firm, but with an edge that made it sound more like an accusation than a greeting. Raymond looked up, smiling politely. "Morning, officer." Clark stood a few feet away, his hands resting on his utility belt. He didn't return the smile. "What are you doing here, sir?" he asked, his tone sharp and direct. Raymond raised an eyebrow, confused by the question. "Just enjoying my coffee. Been coming to this park for years." The officer's gaze narrowed, as though he didn't believe a word Raymond was saying. "Do you live around here?" he pressed. Raymond nodded, the polite smile slowly fading. "Lived a few blocks away for more than 30 years. This is my neighborhood." For a moment, Clark didn't respond. He seemed to weigh Raymond's words, looking him over carefully, as though searching for something that would validate his suspicions. Finally, he spoke again, his tone cold. "Do you have any ID on you?" The request caught Raymond off guard. He had never been asked for ID in the park before. He hesitated, glancing at the officer's face. Clark's expression was unreadable, but his stance had shifted slightly, and Raymond could see the officer's fingers twitching near his holster. "ID?" Raymond repeated, his voice steady, but now tinged with disbelief. "I'm not sure why I'd need that. I'm just sitting here, minding my own business." Clark's lips thinned. "I need to verify that you belong in this neighborhood," he said, his voice growing firmer, more authoritative. "We've had some issues lately." Raymond's jaw clenched. He felt that old, familiar frustration rising in his chest, the frustration that had simmered for years, often buried, but never gone. He had lived through segregation, through decades of being told where he could and couldn't go, and here it was again. In 2024, in his own neighborhood, in a park that he had helped protect and preserve. But this time, Raymond wasn't a young man anymore. He wasn't filled with the same fight that had once burned so brightly in his heart. Now, it was exhaustion more than anything else. "Officer," Raymond said slowly, his voice still calm despite the growing tension. "I've been sitting on this bench long before you were even born. I don't think I need to prove anything." For a brief moment, Clark looked almost startled, but then his expression hardened. He stepped closer, his hand now resting openly on his holster. "Sir, I'm going to need you to show me some identification. Now." The confrontation was drawing attention. A few passers-by slowed their pace, watching the exchange with growing concern. But no one stepped forward to intervene. Not yet. Raymond slowly reached for his cane, which leaned against the bench beside him. He used it to stand, the years weighing heavily on his legs. He wasn't in the mood to argue, but he wasn't about to let this officer push him around either. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer," he said quietly, meeting Clark's eyes. "But I'm not about to let you treat me like a criminal for sitting in a park." The air between them grew thick with tension, each man standing his ground. Officer Clark, young and inexperienced, felt his authority being questioned, his control slipping away. Raymond, tired but resolute, wasn't backing down. It was then that someone else entered the scene. From behind a row of tall hedges, a figure emerged quietly, unnoticed at first by both men. Kelvin Williams, a retired schoolteacher in his early 60s, had been sitting nearby on a bench under the shade of a tree. He had come to Grant Park for the same reason as Raymond: peace and quiet, a chance to reflect and escape the noise of the world. He had noticed the officer when he first entered the park, but like Raymond, thought little of it at first. That changed when he overheard the officer's voice grow sharper and more aggressive. The sight of Officer Clark, standing inches from Raymond with his hand too close to his weapon for comfort, sent a chill down Kelvin's spine. He knew exactly where this was heading, and it wasn't going to end well if someone didn't step in. Kelvin rose from his bench, moving swiftly, but with the quiet grace that years of teaching had given him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a calm, steady demeanor. His footsteps were soft on the gravel as he approached the scene. As Kelvin came into view, Raymond noticed him first. A look of relief flickered across his face, though his body remained tense. Officer Clark, however, was too focused on Raymond to notice the newcomer right away. "Sir," Clark said, his voice low and threatening now, "I'm not going to ask you again. Show me your ID, or I'll have no choice but to escort you out of this park." Raymond didn't flinch. He met the officer's gaze with the quiet strength that came from decades of enduring this kind of treatment. "I don't have to go anywhere," he replied, his voice steady. "I have every right to be here." It was then that Kelvin stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here, officer?" he asked, his tone steady, but carrying the weight of his years of experience. He had dealt with authority figures many times before, both in the classroom and out of it, and he knew how to keep his cool in situations like this. Officer Clark finally noticed Kelvin, his eyes flicking over to him with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to intervene. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his options, but his grip on his holster tightened. "This is none of your concern, sir," Clark snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Please step back." But Kelvin didn't step back. Instead, he took a small step closer, positioning himself just a little nearer to Raymond. He kept his hands loose and visible, making sure not to give the officer any excuse to escalate the situation further. "It's my concern now," Kelvin said calmly. "I've been sitting over there for a while, and I couldn't help but overhear the conversation." Officer Clark's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face twitching slightly. "And what exactly did you hear?" Kelvin glanced at Raymond, then back at the officer. I heard an elderly man, a longtime resident of this neighborhood, being harassed for sitting in a public park. That's what I heard. Clark's face flushed with anger. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His authority, already fragile, was being openly questioned by two men who didn't seem the least bit intimidated by his uniform or his threats. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Kelvin. "You need to watch your tone," Clark growled. "This is official business." Kelvin didn't budge. He met the officer's glare with a level gaze of his own. "I'm not watching anything except you," Kelvin replied, "and what I see is a man overstepping his authority." Raymond, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Kelvin," he said quietly, "it's all right. I don't want any trouble." Kelvin glanced back at Raymond, his face softening for a moment. "This isn't trouble, Ray. It's about standing up for what's right." Officer Clark took another step forward, now standing just inches from Kelvin, his eyes blazing with frustration. "You want trouble?" Clark hissed. "Because I can make this very difficult for you both." Just as the situation seemed poised to explode, another voice rang out, a deep, authoritative voice that carried across the park like a gunshot. "That's enough!" The tension snapped like a rubber band as all three men turned toward the source of the voice. Walking briskly toward them was Captain James Matthews, a senior officer in the Trenton Police Department. In his late 40s, Matthews was a tall, imposing figure with a presence that commanded respect. He had seen the confrontation from the street and had hurried over as soon as he realized what was happening. "Clark," Matthews barked as he approached, "stand down." Officer Clark's face paled. He immediately stepped back, his hand dropping from his holster. "Captain, I said stand down," Matthews repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Clark took another step back, his posture rigid. Matthews turned to Raymond and Kelvin, his face softening slightly. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone respectful, "is everything all right here?" Kelvin, still keeping a close eye on Clark, nodded slowly. "I think we're all right now, Captain, but your officer here seemed a little overzealous." Matthews turned to Clark, his eyes narrowing. "Clark, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Officer Clark stammered, his bravado now completely gone. I was just checking to see if he belonged here, sir. We've had complaints." "You had complaints?" Matthews cut him off. "About an elderly man sitting quietly in a park, minding his own business?" Clark swallowed hard, glancing nervously between Matthews and the two men in front of him. I didn't know who he was." "You didn't need to," Matthews said sharply. "This is a public park. You don't harass people for sitting in public spaces." Raymond, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge of frustration in his tone. "I've been coming to this park for 30 years, Captain," he said, his eyes locked on Clark. "Never had a problem until today." Matthews nodded, his face tight with frustration. "And you shouldn't have had one today. This is not how we do things." He turned to Clark, his voice taking on an edge of finality. "Go back to the station. I'll deal with you later." Clark hesitated for a moment, then nodded stiffly and walked away, his boots dragging across the gravel as he disappeared down the path. The tension in the air seemed to lift with his departure, but it left behind a lingering sense of unease. Matthews turned back to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening. "I apologize for that," he said quietly. "That was unacceptable. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Raymond studied the captain for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I appreciate that, Captain. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I doubt it'll be the last." Matthews sighed, the weight of his position heavy on his shoulders. "I know," he admitted, "but I'm working on it. We're trying to change things." Kelvin, who had remained silent since Clark's departure, finally spoke again. "It's going to take more than just trying, Captain. It's going to take action. Real change." Matthews nodded. You're right. And I promise you, things will change. I'll make sure of it. Raymond, his body still tense, but his voice calm, looked out over the park, his gaze distant. I hope so, he said quietly. I really hope so. The air in Grant Park had become still again, but the tension of the confrontation still hung like a heavy fog. As Captain Matthews watched Officer Clark disappear into the distance, he exhaled deeply, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. He wasn't a stranger to situations like this. He had been on the force long enough to know the struggles his community faced. Raymond, Matthews began, using the older man's first name now, a sign of familiarity. I know this can't fix what just happened, but I want you to know that we're not all like that. Clark, he's new. He's still learning. The words sounded hollow even as he said them. Raymond didn't reply at first. His eyes wandered, taking in the park he had spent so many mornings in, a place that had always brought him peace. Today, though, that peace had been shattered. His hands, now resting on his cane, gripped it tightly. It's always something, he muttered, more to himself than to Matthews. Always something. Kelvin, standing close by, gave a tight nod. It's not just about learning, Captain. It's about understanding, he said. Clark's not just new. He came in here already thinking he knew what to expect from us. That's the problem. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. He knew Kelvin was right. There was a culture within the department, one that had been there long before he ever put on the badge, and it wasn't going to be easy to change. But he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. I'm not going to make excuses for him, Matthews replied, his tone more resolved now. He'll face consequences for this, I assure you. And more than that, we'll be implementing new training. It won't just be for Clark either. Raymond, still silent, turned to face the captain. Training, huh? He let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. You think training is going to change what's in his heart? For a moment, Matthews didn't respond. He had heard this question before, countless times, from men like Raymond, from women in the community who had grown weary of empty promises. The truth was, he didn't know if training could fix what was wrong, but it was the only thing he could offer at that moment. It's a start, he said finally, though even he wasn't entirely convinced. Raymond sighed deeply, the weight of years pressing down on him. His shoulders, once broad and powerful, seemed to sag just a little under the burden of it all. He looked up at Matthews, his eyes filled with the kind of exhaustion that only a man who had lived through decades of struggle could know. I've seen starts before, Captain, he said softly. I've seen them come and go. What I haven't seen is a finish. Kelvin watched the exchange closely, his own heart heavy with the reality they were facing. He respected Captain Matthews, had known him for years, even before he rose to his current position, but respect didn't make him blind to the issues that remained unresolved. He placed a hand gently on Raymond's shoulder, offering silent support. I'm going to hold you to that, Captain, Kelvin said, his voice steady but firm. Because this can't keep happening. Matthews met Kelvin's eyes, and for the first time, Kelvin saw a glimpse of the man behind the badge. There was fatigue there, yes, but there was also determination. You have my word, Matthews replied. I'm not just saying this to calm things down. We need real change. I'll make sure of it. Raymond, feeling the weariness of the morning catching up to him, motioned toward the bench. I think I'm going to sit for a minute. He moved slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement as he lowered himself back onto the bench where the confrontation had begun. He took a deep breath, feeling the strain of the confrontation in his chest. Kelvin stayed close, glancing at the captain one last time before sitting down beside Raymond. Captain Matthews lingered for a moment longer, as if searching for the right words, but in the end, he just gave a respectful nod before walking away. As his footsteps faded into the distance, the park seemed to settle again, though the peaceful atmosphere it once had was not yet restored. For a long while, neither man spoke. The distant sounds of joggers and birds filled the air, but it was as though a blanket of silence had fallen over Raymond and Kelvin. Raymond stared down at his hands, the lines in his skin a map of his life's experiences. The park had always been a place where he could escape the pressures of the world, but now it felt different, tainted. "I'm getting too old for this," Raymond finally muttered, his voice low and worn. Kelvin, who had been gazing out at the park, turned to look at his friend. "Ray, you're not too old," he replied softly. "You're just tired, and you've got every right to be." Raymond let out a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Maybe you're right, but it doesn't make it any easier." For years, Raymond had been fighting battles that no one else seemed to notice. He had lived through segregation, fought for civil rights, and had seen progress in ways that many people today took for granted. But even now, in his 70s, he was still facing the same struggles. The faces and uniforms had changed, but the questions, the suspicions, they were all too familiar. "You know," Raymond began, his eyes distant, "when I was young, I used to think that if we just pushed hard enough, if we just kept fighting, we'd get somewhere, that things would be different for the next generation." Kelvin leaned back on the bench, listening quietly. He had heard stories of Raymond's younger years, of his time in the movement, of the marches and the protests. He had always admired the man's resilience. "And things have changed," Raymond continued. "I've seen it. But days like this, they make me wonder. Makes me wonder if we've really come as far as we think." Kelvin didn't respond right away. He let Raymond's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. He knew the truth of what Raymond was saying. The progress they had fought for was real, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "Maybe we haven't," Kelvin said finally, "but that doesn't mean we give up." "I don't think you've ever been the type to give up, Ray." Raymond gave a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, I guess not. But it gets harder, Kelvin. Every year, it gets harder." Kelvin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared out at the park. "I know it does. But that's why we keep going. That's why we don't stop. Because we can't afford to." The two men sat in silence for a moment longer, letting the morning sun warm their faces. Raymond looked up at the trees, the branches swaying gently in the breeze. For a brief second, the park felt peaceful again, like it had before the officer's arrival. He wished it could always feel that way. Just as Raymond was about to speak, Kelvin's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen before letting out a low sigh. "Looks like this is getting around," he muttered, holding up his phone for Raymond to see. On the screen was a local news alert, a short headline: "Officer confronts elderly man in park. Community outrage grows." Raymond squinted at the screen, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't take long, did it?" Kelvin shook his head, putting the phone away. "Nothing stays quiet these days. It's probably already trending." Raymond leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes for a moment. "So, what now?" Kelvin didn't have an answer. He didn't know what would happen next, whether this would blow over or if it would become the spark for something bigger. But he did know one thing. They weren't going to let it slide. "We keep going," Kelvin said, his voice firm but calm. "We speak up. We make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Raymond opened his eyes, giving a small nod. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "All right." As word spread, the community began to respond. What had started as a quiet confrontation in a nearly empty park was quickly becoming something much larger. By the afternoon, whispers had turned into phone calls, and phone calls into online posts. It wasn't long before the local news picked up the story, and soon enough, a small crowd had gathered at Grant Park. Raymond stayed away from the crowd at first, watching from a distance as people arrived, some carrying signs, others just standing and talking in small groups. It felt surreal. This wasn't what he had wanted. He had come to the park that morning just like any other day, hoping for a little peace and quiet. Now, It seemed that his routine had been upended in a way he hadn't expected. But as he watched, something else stirred inside him. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. And even though he was tired, so tired, he couldn't walk away. Kelvin stood beside him, silent for a while, then nudged Raymond gently. "Looks like people are ready to speak up." Raymond nodded, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. "Yeah, guess they are." The crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people now. Some of them were familiar faces, neighbors and friends from the community, but many were strangers. Young people, old people, people of different backgrounds and races. They had all come together, united by something that Raymond couldn't help but feel was larger than him, larger than all of them. Someone from the crowd waved at him, and Raymond realized with a start that they were calling for him to come forward. He glanced at Kelvin, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "They want to hear from you, Ray," Kelvin said gently. "They need to hear from you." Raymond hesitated for a moment, but then he straightened up, his old military posture returning. Slowly, he began to walk toward the crowd, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement with each step. As he approached, the conversations began to quiet, and all eyes turned toward him. He stood in front of the group, feeling the weight of their gaze on him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had given speeches before, had led marches and rallies in his younger years, but this felt different. This felt more personal. Taking a deep breath, Raymond began to speak, his voice carrying over the now silent crowd. "I didn't come here today looking for a fight," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I came here for peace, just like I do every morning. But sometimes, peace isn't enough." He paused, glancing around at the faces in front of him, searching for the right words. "We've all been through this before," he continued. "We've all had moments where we were questioned, doubted, judged, not by the content of our character, but by the color of our skin. And it's exhausting." Raymond's words hung in the air for a moment, the crowd absorbing them in heavy silence. He could see the reflection of their own struggles in their eyes, the shared pain and exhaustion of a community that had been fighting the same battles for generations. He hadn't expected to be here, standing before a crowd, but there was no turning back now. "I'm tired," Raymond said, his voice quieter now but still carrying across the park. "Tired of being questioned, tired of having to prove I belong. I've lived in this neighborhood for decades. I've raised my children here. I've watched this park grow, helped it thrive. But even after all that, I'm still made to feel like I don't belong." He glanced around the group, making eye contact with as many people as he could. There were nods of understanding, faces tightened with the weight of their own experiences. "That young officer, he saw me sitting here and decided I didn't belong. Why? Because I was sitting in a park while black?" Raymond shook his head, a wave of anger flashing across his usually calm demeanor. "I've seen this too many times. I saw it in the 60s, and now, here we are. Nothing's changed." The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of frustration passing through them. They had gathered because this wasn't just about Raymond. It was about all of them, about a system that continued to target their community without reason. Kelvin stepped up beside Raymond, his presence offering quiet support. Raymond paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "We're tired, but we can't stop," Raymond said, his voice growing stronger. "Every time something like this happens, it takes a piece of us, but it also lights a fire. We've been through too much to let this slide. If we let this go, what's stopping them from coming after the next person, or the one after that?" The crowd's energy was building now, a palpable current of determination running through them. What had begun as a quiet gathering was turning into something more, a movement fueled by the frustrations and hopes of the community. Kelvin took a step forward, addressing the crowd alongside his friend. "We all know what needs to happen. We can't just wait for the system to fix itself. We need to demand that it be fixed. That starts right here, right now. If you want to see change, we've got to be the ones to make it happen." A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice steady, but laced with anger. "We've had enough talks. How do we make them listen?" Raymond and Kelvin exchanged a glance. They knew this wasn't going to be easy. Protests, petitions, discussions, these had all been tried before, but they also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. "We've got to show up," Kelvin said, his voice firm. "They need to see that we won't be silent anymore. We demand accountability. We demand better." The crowd began to buzz with conversation, energy crackling through the air. People began to talk about organizing a rally, contacting city officials, demanding answers. Some of them had been involved in community organizing before, but others were new to this kind of action, their passion born out of frustration with the system. As the crowd swelled with purpose, Raymond couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had been tired, was still tired, but seeing the faces of the younger generation stepping up to carry the torch gave him a new sense of strength. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Kelvin placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, as if sensing the shift in his mood. "We're not doing this alone, Ray," he said quietly. "Look around. People are ready." Raymond nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "I know. It's time." The next few days were a blur of planning and action. Word of the incident spread quickly through social media and local news outlets, and soon the entire city of Trenton was buzzing with talk of the confrontation in Grant Park. People were angry, not just about what had happened to Raymond, but about the broader pattern of racial profiling and harassment that had been quietly bubbling beneath the surface for years. Kelvin, along with a small group of community organizers, set to work immediately. They called meetings, sent out emails, and met with local leaders to plan a rally that would take place in the heart of the city. It wasn't going to be just about Raymond's experience. It was going to be about the experiences of everyone in the community who had been affected by discrimination and injustice. Raymond, for his part, wasn't sure he wanted to be at the center of it all. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, even in his younger days. But Kelvin had insisted, and Raymond knew deep down that this was bigger than his own discomfort. If his experience could help shed light on the broader issues facing his community, then it was worth it. The day of the rally arrived quickly. Grant Park, once again, became the gathering point for the community, but this time the quiet space was filled with hundreds of people. Signs were held high, reading messages like, "Justice for all," "We belong," and "No more silence." The air was thick with purpose and determination. Raymond stood near the front of the crowd, leaning on his cane as he surveyed the scene. He could feel the energy in the air, the sense that something important was happening. Kelvin was beside him, speaking with a few of the organizers as they prepared to address the crowd. "This is bigger than us now," Kelvin said, turning to Raymond. "This is about the whole city, the whole country." Raymond nodded, though he was still trying to absorb it all. He had never imagined that something so personal could spark such a movement. The faces in the crowd, young and old, black and white, reminded him of the marches he had participated in all those years ago. It was a bittersweet reminder that the fight was far from over. A young woman stepped up to the microphone first, her voice clear and strong as she introduced the rally. She spoke about the importance of standing together, of holding the system accountable for the way it treated people of color. She called for justice, not just for Raymond, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted. When it was Raymond's turn to speak, the crowd quieted. All eyes were on him as he approached the microphone, his cane tapping lightly against the wooden stage with each step. He paused for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before him, and then he began to speak. "I've been here before," Raymond said, his voice carrying across the park. "I've stood in front of crowds just like this, fighting for the same things we're fighting for today, and I'll be honest with you, it's exhausting." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but Raymond wasn't finished. "But we can't stop," he continued. "We can't let our exhaustion silence us, because if we do, nothing changes. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of waiting for change that never comes." He looked out over the crowd, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the people who had gathered to hear him speak. "This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. It's about our children, our grandchildren. It's about making sure they don't have to fight these same battles." There was a swell of applause, but Raymond kept going. His words were coming faster now, his passion spilling out in a way he hadn't expected. "We're here because we deserve better. We deserve to be treated with respect, with dignity. And if we don't demand it, then who will? So I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, don't let this moment pass by. Don't let this be just another rally, just another day. Let this be the start of something real." The applause grew louder, and for a moment, Raymond felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. He wasn't done fighting, not yet. As the rally came to an end, the organizers began discussing the next steps. They weren't going to let the momentum die down. Kelvin, Raymond, and the rest of the core group made plans to meet with city officials, pushing for tangible change in police training and community engagement. Captain Matthews had been watching from the edge of the crowd, taking in everything with a serious expression. He had come to the rally not just as an observer, but as a supporter. After the incident with Officer Clark, he knew his department needed to take immediate and meaningful steps to address the issues that had been ignored for far too long. When the crowd began to disperse, Matthews made his way over to Raymond and Kelvin, his face set with resolve. "Raymond, Kelvin," he greeted them, "that was powerful, and I want you to know, I'm listening." Kelvin nodded, his expression cautious but hopeful. "That's a start, Captain, but we need more than just listening." Matthews met his gaze, his voice firm. "I know. I've already started making changes within the department. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're committed to making this right." Raymond studied the captain for a moment, then nodded. "It's a long road, Captain, but we'll hold you to that." Matthews offered his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Raymond took it. It was a symbolic gesture, a small step toward rebuilding the trust that had been eroded over the years. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings, discussions, and a renewed sense of purpose within the community. Raymond continued to speak out, both at local events and in private meetings with city officials. He had become an unexpected voice of the movement, a role he hadn't sought out but had embraced nonetheless. Kelvin, too, was deeply involved, working alongside organizers to push for concrete changes in police policies. They weren't going to settle for half measures or empty promises. They wanted real accountability, real reform. One day, as Raymond and Kelvin sat together in Grant Park, once again on the same bench where it had all begun, Raymond looked around at the park with a new sense of hope. "We've still got a long way to go," Raymond said quietly, his voice carrying a note of optimism. "But for the first time in a long time, I think we're headed in the right direction." Kelvin smiled, leaning back on the bench. "Yeah, Ray, we are." As the two men sat in the park, watching the sun set over the trees, they both knew that the fight was far from over. But they also knew that, together, they could make a difference. The days stretched into weeks, and the movement in Trenton, Tennessee, gained momentum. It wasn't just about that single moment in Grant Park anymore. The community was waking up in a way that felt new, different. There was hope, but more than that, there was action. Meetings were held in local churches, in community centers, even in the homes of organizers who wanted to ensure that every voice was heard. Raymond found himself at the center of it all, something he hadn't anticipated, and frankly, something he hadn't wanted. At his age, he had thought he'd leave the fighting to the younger generation, but here he was, once again standing on the front lines, advocating for change. One morning, as he sat on his usual bench in Grant Park, a woman approached him. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, wearing a plain green hoodie and jeans, her curly hair tied up in a bun. Her name was Anita, and she had been one of the newer faces at the rallies, quietly standing in the back, listening intently to the speeches, but never stepping up to speak herself. "Mr. Brooks?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a mix of respect and hesitation. Raymond looked up from his paper, blinking against the early morning sun. "Yes, that's me." She shifted on her feet, clearly nervous. I've been coming to the rallies, listening. I'm not really the type to speak up, but..." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to thank you." Raymond folded his paper and set it aside, giving her his full attention. "For what?" "For standing up. For giving us a voice," Anita said, her voice growing a bit stronger. I didn't think people like me would be heard. But you and Mr. Kelvin, you've been doing this for so long, and now it feels like maybe things can change." Raymond smiled, though it was a tired smile, the kind of smile that comes from a lifetime of knowing how hard it was to get people to really listen. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us. You're part of this too. Every voice matters, even the quiet ones." Anita looked down, clearly moved by his words. I didn't think anyone would care what I had to say. I mean, who am I, right? Just some girl working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet. I didn't think I'd make a difference." Raymond shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. Every person in this fight makes a difference. You're just as important as anyone else standing up. Don't doubt that." For a moment, they sat in silence, the park coming alive around them as people started their morning walks, jogs, and daily routines. Anita stayed beside him, her posture relaxing slightly, as she realized that she didn't need to have all the answers to be part of something bigger than herself. "I want to help," she said, after a long pause. "But I don't know where to start." Raymond chuckled softly. "No one knows where to start. We all just figure it out along the way." Meanwhile, across town, Kelvin had been hard at work with the core group of community leaders, hammering out details for their next major step. A public forum with city officials, police representatives, and concerned citizens. They wanted transparency, real accountability. They wanted to make sure that the promises they were hearing from people like Captain Matthews wouldn't just fade away once the media coverage died down. The forum was set to take place at the local high school auditorium. It was large enough to hold a few hundred people, and it was neutral ground, somewhere both the community and the city officials could come together to have a real conversation. On the night of the forum, the auditorium was packed. People stood in the aisles, sat cross-legged on the floor, and filled the back of the room where they could. Raymond stood near the front with Kelvin, who was holding a clipboard, his brow furrowed in concentration as he went over the night's agenda. "You ready for this, Ray?" Kelvin asked, glancing up at him. Raymond shrugged, leaning on his cane as he scanned the crowd. "Ready or not, here we are." Kelvin smiled. "That's the spirit." The forum opened with introductions from the city council members, each of them speaking briefly about their dedication to improving the community and ensuring that the events at Grant Park wouldn't happen again. But the crowd was restless, waiting for real answers, real solutions. When Captain Matthews took the stage, there was a murmur in the crowd. People weren't sure what to expect from him. He had been at the rally, had promised change, but promises weren't enough anymore. They wanted action. "I know why you're all here," Matthews began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of responsibility. "You're here because the trust between this community and the police department has been broken, and that's on us. I won't stand up here and make excuses, because there are none. What happened to Mr. Brooks should never have happened, and we're committed to making sure it never happens again." There was a brief pause, as though he was waiting to see how the crowd would react. Some nodded quietly, others crossed their arms, clearly waiting for more. Matthews continued. "We've already started implementing new training for all of our officers, training that focuses on de-escalation, community engagement, and, most importantly, understanding the history and context of the communities we serve. It's not enough just to know the law. Officers need to know the people they're protecting." The crowd seemed to shift slightly, some of the tension easing, but not disappearing. People wanted more than just words. A hand shot up in the crowd, a young man in the back of the auditorium. Training's fine, but how do we know this isn't just another round of empty promises? What are you actually going to do to hold officers accountable when they step out of line? The room went quiet, all eyes on Captain Matthews. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the gravity of the question. That's a fair point, he admitted. And it's not just about training. We're creating a civilian oversight board, people from this community, who will have direct access to police reports, body camera footage, and the ability to hold officers accountable. We can't police ourselves if the community doesn't trust us. This board will ensure that there is transparency. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, this time in support. People were skeptical, but the idea of having real oversight, a system where they could directly hold officers responsible, was something they hadn't expected to hear. Raymond, sitting near the front with Kelvin, exchanged a glance with him. "That's more than I thought they'd offer," he whispered. Kelvin nodded. "It's a start." But the night wasn't over. More hands went up, more questions were asked. People shared their personal stories of run-ins with police officers, moments of fear, moments of humiliation. Matthews stayed on the stage the whole time, taking it all in, not interrupting, not deflecting. By the end of the night, it was clear that the forum had only scratched the surface. This was going to be a long process. As the crowd began to disperse, Raymond and Kelvin lingered near the stage, talking with a few of the city officials. Captain Matthews approached them, looking exhausted but determined. "Raymond, Kelvin," he greeted them, his voice weary but respectful. "I know this isn't enough. I know there's more work to be done, but we're committed to doing it." Kelvin extended his hand, shaking Matthews firmly. "We'll hold you to that, Captain, and if you need our help, you know where to find us." Matthews smiled faintly. "I'll take you up on that. We need voices like yours if we're going to make this work." Raymond, watching the exchange, felt something shift inside him. He had seen this kind of thing before, promises of change, of progress. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion in Matthews's eyes, the weariness of a man who knew that the system he worked in was flawed and was finally ready to admit it. Or maybe it was the crowd, the people who had come together not just to demand answers, but to take part in finding those answers. As the night drew to a close, Raymond and Kelvin walked out of the auditorium together, the crisp night air wrapping around them. They didn't speak for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Raymond broke the silence. "You think this'll really change anything?" Kelvin glanced at him, his face serious but hopeful. "I think it's a start, Ray. I really do." Raymond nodded slowly, his mind still turning over everything he had heard that night. He had spent so much of his life fighting for change, for progress, and there were moments, like tonight, when he wondered if it was all worth it. But then he remembered the faces of the people in the crowd, the voices of the young people who were standing up and demanding to be heard. And he knew deep down that it was worth it. It had to be. In the weeks that followed the forum, the Civilian Oversight Board was established, and it didn't take long for the community to get involved. People from all walks of life signed up to be a part of the board, to help oversee the changes being implemented in the police department. Raymond found himself more involved than he had expected. He had thought the forum would be the end of his public role, that he'd be able to step back and let the younger generation take over. But his phone kept ringing, and every time Kelvin or one of the other organizers called, he couldn't say no. "You've still got work to do," Kelvin had told him one afternoon as they sat together in Grant Park. "You're the heart of this movement, Ray." Raymond had laughed at that, brushing off the compliment. But deep down, he knew Kelvin was right. He still had a role to play. Maybe it wasn't the role he had expected at this point in his life, but it was important. And if he could help guide the next generation, then he wasn't going to stop now. One day, as Raymond sat on his bench, watching the park fill with people. He thought back to the day it had all begun. That moment with Officer Clark had been just one in a long line of similar moments throughout his life. But this time, something had changed. The community had rallied, and for once, it felt like their voices were being heard. Anita appeared again, her familiar green hoodie blending into the background of the park as she approached. She smiled shyly as she sat beside him, the same spot she had taken weeks earlier. "You're becoming a regular," Raymond teased, his eyes twinkling with warmth. Anita laughed softly, nodding. "Yeah, I guess I am." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them watching the world go by. There was peace here, a kind of peace that Raymond hadn't felt in a long time. And it wasn't just because the park was quiet. It was because, for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. "I think I'm ready," Anita said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Raymond turned to her, a curious look on his face. "Ready for what?" "To speak up," she said. "To really be a part of this. I've been watching from the sidelines for too long. I think it's time." Raymond smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You'll do just fine," he said. "I know it." And as the sun began to set over Grant Park, casting a warm golden light over the trees and paths, Raymond felt something new, a sense of completion. He knew the road ahead was still long, still full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. And that was enough. For now.